let's make some basic shapes in Inkscape. There are two kinds of elements that make up an Inkscape document. One is an object, and the other is a path. There's also text, but I would include text in with an object because it's sort of a smart kind of shape that Inkscape uses. So for instance, if I come over here and grab the rectangle, this is an object. And when I do this, you'll notice that there are some handles that appear around the object, and they kind of allow you to control the way that you interact with that object. If I grab a circle, it's going to be the same thing. Now if I hold Control down, you'll notice that it'll snap to certain aspect ratios. That's particularly helpful if you need to get an exact circle or something like that. If I right click on one of these shapes, you'll notice I get a bunch of different options. And one of them is duplicate here. You'll also notice that in most of the menus for Inkscape, there are little hints at what the keyboard shortcut is. That's going to be really valuable because over time you can start to get used to what those keyboard shortcuts are, but you don't have to use them right away. So let's move these objects around a little bit here. If I take an object and I duplicate it, let's say this one, and let's just say I make the color a little darker, you'll notice if I have an object selected, and it could be either an object or a path, it doesn't matter. Anything that you select in Inkscape will have these handles around it. And so the corner one, if I grab one of these corner ones, it'll let me resize it in any direction. Now, if that might not be exactly what I want, maybe I want to keep the aspect ratio. If I hold down Control while I'm scaling from the corner, it's going to keep that aspect ratio. So no matter what I do with my mouse, if I'm holding down Control, it's going to keep the aspect ratio the same. Likewise, if I hold down the Shift key, it's going to put a plus sign in the middle, and it's going to keep the center of the object at the same point. So that's really valuable if you need to resize or change the aspect ratio of an object without moving it. If I combine the two, I can say Control and Shift, and it will resize it based on keeping the aspect ratio and keeping it in the center. Now, that might not also be exactly what you want, because maybe you want to notice that here I've got at the top and the bottom, it's a little larger than it is on the sides for this rectangle because it's taller than it is wide. So there is actually, I'll show you this under Path. These Path tools, although they're for paths, for working with paths, most of these options will work for objects as well. So if I select Path and I go to Inset, and you'll notice there's a control there as well. So Path Inset, there's a keyboard shortcut, Control and open parentheses. So if I use that keyboard shortcut, I can now inset and outset as needed, and this is going to keep it just based on its size. Bring it in based on its exact shape. It's going to bring it, inset it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about snapping quickly. So if I have, and I'm going to grab this color, you'll see me jumping over here to this fill and stroke dialog, which we'll get to some more details there in a minute. If I have a shape like this and I want to snap it, right now I have snapping turned on. If I turn snapping off, nothing snaps, okay? But if I have it on, it's going to snap to specific things, okay? But I can control exactly what it snaps to over here. So I'm going to enable the bounding boxes, and then I'm also going to enable the edges and midpoints of an edge. And what that's going to do is let me snap to the center here of this. And then when I drag this down in size, I actually get it to snap pretty well there to both sides. Alright, now with snapping enabled, that's great. If I duplicate an object and I bring it down and I've got snapping on, that's awesome. But if I turn snapping off, there's another way to be a little bit more precise in your movement of objects. If I just grab this and drag it, it's going to go anywhere. But if I hold down Control, it's going to snap to a single axis, either left and right or up and down. That's a really handy thing. It's handy to know about that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these shapes. So if I grab one of these, again, the handle here allows you to manipulate the corners of a rectangle. If you're dealing with a star, you're going to have other points, control points that you can use. In our case, this should be fine, and maybe I'll tweak that a little bit. That's a little bit too rounded. Okay, now over here on the right, if I could grab this fill and stroke. I've been using this fill and stroke. Let me just talk about it really briefly. The fill is whatever you have. Obviously the fill. Stroke is going to be your outline, and you might have stroke style, obviously, is the kind of line that it is. Depending on your style, that's going to be something you're going to want to use. I tend not to use stroke very much because I'm using the kind of styles that I work with in Inkscape tend not to need that. Under fill, there's different kinds of fill, and one of the big, more common ones is gradient. You can find that you're going to use this a lot. This icon is broken for me in my version of Inkscape, but this is the edit gradient icon. So when you select gradient, it's going to take that fill color that you had before and put it on one side of the gradient, and it's going to take the same color, put it on the other side of the gradient, and make the alpha all the way to see-through. Okay, so the first thing I always do is to grab that and drag it back, and then you could change the color here. In my case, I don't really want to change the color. What I want to do is add a control point here. So you'll notice if I hover over this line, I get a little plus. If I double click that plus, I get an additional control point. Now, you can do anything you want with this. You can get really crazy. In my case, I'll just make it a little lighter. Now, if I want to change this, maybe I want to change this whole thing. Let's do that, because this, brown, brown, and brown gets a little boring. So we'll make the sides kind of darker here. Alright, so now we have an object that kind of looks kind of nice, has a little bit of depth to it. Let's size it down. We use Control to size it down appropriately, and we'll put a little book on the bookshelf. Now I've duplicated that. We'll come in here, and notice now when I click on an object like this, the edges, those controls change to arrows going the other way. What this allows me to do is actually skew if I want to, or rotate. Now when I rotate, it's a really fine rotation, so when you come around and you go, is that 100%, 90 degrees exactly? I'm not sure, right? So there are two ways to solve that. If I grab the corner and I hold down Control, which is going to be a bit of a theme here, it'll snap into major degrees. The other way to do it, you'll notice if I have an object selected at the top, we have this dynamic bar that kind of gives me contextual tools. One of them is rotate. I can flip it this way too, depending on what I'm doing here. Alright, with that, in this case, I'm just gonna roll it over on its side just a little bit here, and we'll put it up here. Maybe I'll make it a little smaller. Alright, so now we've got a couple of books. One thing more yet, let's talk about text. So if I add text, there are two ways to add text in Inkscape. And I'll click on this text tool here. One is to click and drag and make a box. And you'll notice that gives me this box with a control point down here. Another way to add text is simply to click. And if I just click, notice there's no bounding box. This is actually important. So the difference between these two, they look like text. They're the same size by default. They're very similar. But when I click on this versus clicking on this one, the difference is that if it has this bounding box like this, it's a different kind of object, and what will happen is different kinds of programs will not know how to interpret that. And so in some cases, if you export an Inkscape, you save it as an SVG, some applications will not interpret this kind of object at all, and it'll just be blank. It'll just be a blank space. So that's not what you want. Whereas this, if you just click and you just start to type, this kind of object will show up. So this will render for pretty much everything. So it's best practice. I've just gotten into the habit. I just click, and then if I need another line, I can do that or whatever. But I tend not to use the dragging a box around. With text, you have all the same controls as you do with other objects. You can set the color. You can make it a gradient if you want. Whatever you want to do. You have the same controls for scaling, skewing, all of that stuff. So if I click it again, you can skew it and everything else. Now, if I have these two objects here, I want to move them, but I want to keep them all together. So if I select them both, I can group them out of the object menu here. And now, when I click here, it's going to select them both. And they are going to work now as a single object. So if I want to rotate it back, I can set it over here on the shelf. Maybe make it an appropriate size. And with that, we now have a basic understanding of how to use shapes in Inkscape. So that's it.